In May 1940, along a quiet stretch of Belgian farmland, a thin defensive line held its ground. The men there were Belgian soldiers, dug in and waiting. They were told reinforcements were coming. But those reinforcements never arrived. In the spring of 1940, Europe was still trying to believe that war would not touch its borders again. The Great War had ended only 2 decades earlier, and the memory of trench mud and shattered cities was still fresh in many minds. Belgium, a small country caught between great powers, had declared neutrality. The government hoped that neutrality would protect them. It was a hope built on treaties and old promises. But it was also a hope that depended on others. Belgium's army was modernizing, but it was not prepared for the speed of a modern invasion. The country had a long border with Germany and a shorter one with France. To the east lay the Ardennes forests, considered difficult terrain. Belgium believed the Ardennes would slow any attacker. In reality, the Ardennes became the route of surprise. On the morning of May 10, 1940, German forces began their invasion of the Low Countries. Belgium's defenses were immediately tested. The Belgian command quickly ordered a defensive line to be established along the River Dyle and the nearby canal system. The plan was to hold until French and British armies could arrive and support the defense. The Belgian government still hoped that by holding the line, they could force a stalemate or a negotiated settlement. In the chaos of the first days, Belgian units were moved rapidly. Some were sent westward, others east. Communication was strained. Many units were placed in positions that were incomplete or poorly supplied. The men who arrived at the defensive line found themselves facing a vast German advance, with tanks and aircraft moving faster than anyone expected. Among these positions was a small sector near the town of Gembloux, where Belgian infantry dug into shallow trenches and prepared their machine guns. The soldiers were exhausted. They had marched for days and had little time to rest. Their orders were clear: hold the line. They were told that French forces would soon arrive. They were told that the Allies would form a solid front. But the reality on the ground was different. The Belgian High Command received reports of German breakthroughs elsewhere. The French and British lines were being pushed back. The Belgian units were increasingly isolated. Yet the men in the defensive line remained committed. They believed their duty was to hold. They believed that if they held, reinforcements would arrive. The first night in the trenches was silent in a way that felt unnatural. No one spoke loudly. The men listened for engines, for distant gunfire, for anything that would confirm that help was coming. Instead, they heard only the wind and the soft rustle of the canal reeds. By dawn, the line was in place. The men had their weapons ready. They had their orders. They had their fear. And they had the certainty that they were not truly alone, because the world had promised them support. By the second day of fighting, the defensive line was no longer a quiet trench. It became a narrow barrier against a force that moved like a storm. German units advanced with coordination and speed. They used armored divisions to punch through weak points. They used air support to break enemy morale and destroy positions from above. The Belgian defenders had no such advantages. Their weapons were effective, but their numbers were not. The Belgian soldiers fought with discipline. They held their ground. They aimed carefully. They waited for the German infantry to come within range. In the fields and canals, the fighting became a grim rhythm. The defenders fired, reloaded, and fired again. Some men tried to move between positions to share ammunition. Others carried wounded comrades to the small dugouts. The rain began to fall, turning the soil into a slick, dark mud that clung to boots and uniforms. The German assault continued. Each wave was met with fire. Yet each wave was larger than the last. The defenders began to realize the truth: the line was not being strengthened. No new troops arrived. No new weapons came. No fresh supplies reached the men. The orders from command remained the same, but the reality was changing. The Belgian officers were forced to make hard decisions. They had to decide where to place their limited ammunition. They had to decide whether to withdraw or to hold. They were told that the French army would arrive soon. They were told that the British would hold the line. But as the hours passed, those promises became thinner. The men in the trenches began to understand the meaning of being left alone. It was not just that help was late. It was that help was no longer possible. The Allies were retreating. The German advance had split the front. Communication lines were cut. The Belgian soldiers became a small island of resistance in a sea of movement. The defensive line was designed to be part of a larger system. Without that system, the line became a trap. The men could not easily retreat without exposing themselves to German fire. The terrain was open and flat, and the German tanks could move quickly. The Belgian positions were exposed. Yet the soldiers continued to fight. Some of them had families back home. Some had children. Some were barely old enough to be in uniform. Still, they held. They fired. They waited. They watched the horizon for the shape of friendly troops. They watched the sky for the sound of Allied aircraft. By the third day, the defenders were exhausted. Their ammunition was low. Their casualties were high. The trenches were filled with mud and blood. The men could no longer count on reinforcements. Their officers began to speak in shorter sentences. They began to prepare for the worst. But the line still held. It held because the men refused to let it fall. They held because they believed that if they held, something would change. They held because they had nowhere else to go. And then, the German artillery began to shift its focus. The moment of collapse did not arrive like a sudden explosion. It arrived like a long, deliberate pressure that finally broke the line. On the morning of the fourth day, the German artillery began to pound the defensive positions with greater intensity. The shelling was constant. It shook the ground. It destroyed the trenches. It tore apart the wooden supports. It turned the fields into craters. The Belgian soldiers tried to keep their positions. They fired back when they could. They shouted orders. They tried to move wounded men to safer areas. But the artillery did not stop. The Germans had identified the key points of resistance. They targeted them relentlessly. The noise was deafening. The air filled with smoke and dust. The men could barely breathe. As the day progressed, German infantry began to move forward in greater numbers. They used the chaos of the shelling to advance. The defenders were forced to fight in broken lines. Some positions were overrun. Some were abandoned. Some men were captured. Others were killed in place. The Belgian commanders realized that the line could not hold forever. They sent messages to headquarters. They asked for orders. They received only silence. The radio channels were jammed or destroyed. The messages were not reaching anyone. In the midst of the fighting, one of the officers looked at the faces of his men. They were young. They were tired. They were frightened. He understood then that the defensive line was not just a military position. It was a symbol of hope. The hope that the world had not forgotten them. The hope that the Allies would arrive. But the Allies were not coming. The German advance broke through one sector. The defenders tried to form a new line, but the terrain offered little cover. The canal was no longer a barrier. It was a trap. The water was filled with debris. The banks were torn apart. The men who tried to cross were exposed. The German tanks began to roll into the area. They were unstoppable. The Belgian soldiers had no anti-tank weapons strong enough to stop them. The tanks crushed barriers and pushed through the fields. The defenders were forced to retreat, but the retreat was chaotic. The men were separated. The officers lost contact with their units. Some soldiers fled into the nearby woods. Others tried to hide in farmhouses. Many were captured. Some were killed while attempting to surrender. The defensive line that had held for days was no longer a line. It was a series of broken positions, scattered bodies, and abandoned equipment. The most devastating loss was not just the men. It was the loss of the promise that they were not alone. The defenders realized that the line had been left without reinforcement. The world had moved on, and they were still there, fighting a battle that had already been decided. By evening, the German forces controlled the area. The Belgian defenders had been pushed back or captured. The land was silent except for the distant sounds of movement. The fields were filled with the remains of war. And the men who had fought there were no longer part of the story. The line was broken. The Belgian defenders were pushed back. Some fled into the woods. Some were captured. Some were never seen again. The battlefield grew quiet. Not because the war stopped, but because the men were gone. Their voices disappeared into the mud. Their boots left no trace in the rain. The canal, once a barrier, became a boundary of memory. It held the scars of the fight. It held the broken wood and abandoned rifles. It held the silence. The world continued to move. The maps changed. New lines were drawn. But the place where they stood stayed the same. A field. A canal. A few shattered trenches. No one wrote about their names. No one remembered their faces. The stories of the defensive line vanished. Not because the battle was small, but because it was forgotten. The soldiers were left alone in the end. Left alone by reinforcements. Left alone by history. Left alone by time. Years later, the land returned to quiet. Crops grew where bullets once flew. Grass covered the trenches. The canal water flowed, indifferent. The memory faded. The men became shadows. The defensive line became a footnote. And the silence remained. The only witness was the earth. The only proof was the empty field. And even that slowly disappeared. As if the battle never happened, these stories are rarely told. Subscribe if you want to hear the next one.